So ladies and gentlemen, please give a really warm welcome to Ewan Irvine.
Thank you, and a very good afternoon. And thanks for inviting me along to speak about the subject of Are We All Psychic? Now, it's a subject that fascinates me. It always has. And I've done this talk a few times, but the first time I ever gave this talk was to a group called the Edinburgh Fortean Society. And I never really thought much about it until a few days before, and I thought, what is the Fortean Society? So I Googled it, good old Mr. Google. And I found that the word Fortean related to paranormal phenomena. Fine with that. But then I found that under that and the Fortean banner came everything from anti-gravity, bifold brown anti-gravity effect, candlewick effect, doomsday clock, special project HT304, transient lunar phenomena. And then I found one that scared me the most before the talk, and that was the seer torture technique. So I decided not to look at that article. I was now nervous enough. But what do? I am a medium, and I suppose in many ways that phrase that, yes, I talk to dead people. Now, the subject of ghosts and everything has also fascinated me, really since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. And I always loved the books on hauntings and legendary tales. I had a fascination of all the old tales of Edinburgh, and my history project at the time really looked at the rise of Victorian Edinburgh. And over the years, I found that in the central part of Edinburgh, the Royal Mile, there's really just as much above ground as there is below ground. The vaults, the old streets, and certainly something that held my fascination. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. It's part of the road I've taken, that I've discovered that the answer, I hope, to that question, are we all psychic? Now, I go back to when I was young again, and many, many years ago. But we used to go family holidays, and my parents used to love going round many of the stately homes. And I always remember there was one brilliant place called Plasmore, and it's in Conway in Wales. Has anyone heard of it? Fascinating place, and I still remember it to this day, and that's almost coming up for 40 years. I remember there was one room, and it was the haunted room. Now, briefly, the story goes that Robert Wynne, the owner, his pregnant wife was in the tower, and she was watching for her husband's return. With her was her young son. Now, she decided to leave the tower as it was cold, but on descending the stairs, she tripped and she fell, and she was injured along with her son. Now, it's said that the servants carried her into the room, which was called the lantern room, and this is now the haunted room. And they sent for the doctor. Now, the usual doctor was already with a patient, so he could not come. So a more junior doctor attended her. He immediately saw how badly injured she was, along with her child. And he didn't feel he had enough experience to deal with the case. So he wanted to go. But the servants locked him in rather than have nobody attending their mistress. Now, later on, the master of the house did return home and was told of the story. But when he got up to the lantern room, the doctor could not be found. But unfortunately, his wife, his premature baby, and the child were dead. Now, it said he was filled with rage, and absolutely anger at the doctor fleeing from the scene. And he vowed to hunt the doctor down, but the doctor was never, ever seen again. He had escaped. No one knew how, no one knew why. But that room is said to be haunted now by the master always looking for the doctor. Now, it's a sad story, and it varies a little in the telling from place to place, but the basic story is the same. But the reason I mention this story is that my father, when we were going round many of the houses, he used to love to take pictures. There's an old-fashioned SLR camera with the flash and everything. And he used to take constant pictures of the rooms and everything as we went round these. This was different on this day. In that lantern room, his camera refused to work. It wouldn't turn, then the flash wouldn't work. And my father, being my father, tried it in other rooms, and it worked fine. I remember him coming back into the lantern room. Again, it refused to work. Now, at that age, and almost we're talking 40 years ago, we didn't have the massive ghost hunting groups that we have now. And probably they would have been able to give an opinion, whether it was logical or whether it was something else. And I don't know to this day if it was a problem with the camera, a problem with the light, or something else. But I've realized over the years as well that I'm not the only person to be fascinated by such things as ghosts and the paranormal. And we know that the British nation has a fascination with ghosts, the paranormal, the psychic world. And there probably is unlikely to be a person who has not experienced something or knows somebody that experienced something that they can't quite explain. Now, there was a study a few years back, and it was by the Consumer Analysis Group. And it came up with some statistics, as you can see there. Of the number of people they interviewed, 36% believed in God or a higher power. 47% believed in intelligent life on another planet. 57% believed in ghosts. And 67% believed in the power of psychics. There was also a survey of the attitude and lifestyle of 8,000 adults by researchers from Leeds University. And it revealed that within that study, there was a longing for a spiritual understanding about things. And it also found that belief in the paranormal and the psychic had really started to overtake conventional religious beliefs. Some survey results also showed that 50% believed in telepathy, 55% in second sight, 67% in astrology, and 15% in abduction by aliens. Now, there was one last survey that I looked at, and this was a survey of more than 1,000 people conducted by National Savings and Investment. And they found that women were twice as likely as men to believe in superstition. And half of women think ignoring rituals such as walking underneath a ladder can change their luck for the worse. I have to say, I never walk under a ladder. But less than a quarter of men admitted to being superstitious. Now, there was also a north and south divide. The research showed that England is more cynical than Scotland because 36% of England believed in ancient rituals and omens, and up in Scotland it was 44%. And we can start to see how that differs around Wales, Scotland, England, Ireland. I believe myself that as society evolves, the more we are looking at a spiritual existence. And this includes the psychic, which I believe, to a certain extent, is in us all. And there was an event that happened 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, that for me perhaps summed up the psychic ability that we all have. And it really begins in the animal kingdom. Now, at the very end of 2004, and 10 days before Christmas, there was giant tsunami waves that slammed into Sri Lanka and the Indian coastlines. But something amazing happened. The wild animals seemed to know that something was about to happen. And according to many of the eyewitness accounts, the following events happened. Elephants screamed and ran for higher ground. Dogs refused to go outdoors. Flamingos abandoned their low-lying breeding areas. Zoo animals rushed into their shelters and could not be enticed to come back out. Now, the belief, of course, is that wild and domestic animals possess that sixth sense. And in some way, they knew that the earth was about to shake. And that is something that they've known for many centuries when something's about to happen. According to wildlife experts, they believe that animals' more acute hearing, and other senses might enable them to hear or feel the earth's vibrations. And this, in turn, tips them off to approaching disaster long before us humans even really begin to know what was going on. Now, the massive tsunami that happened was triggered by a magnitude 9 quake off the coast of northern Sumatra Island. Now, the giant waves rolled through the Indian Ocean and unfortunately killed more than 150,000 people in a dozen countries. But relatively few animals were reported dead. And again, this raised the possibility that animals somehow sense impending disaster. But it led me to thinking and really looking back on the animal kingdom. And when we think about it, we were all at one time unable to converse in any sort of language, if we go back to the beginnings of human time. But we used that psychic ability. And that psychic ability we used for fear, happiness, everything. One thing I found as well is as we go through childhood, often that ability we have, that psychic ability that we have, is somehow taken away. And that's many respects because we're taught right from wrong. And we're conditioned in many ways in society. There are many times when a child's told not to speak to an imaginary friend. And also, and probably in many ways we can see it natural, as parents protect us from that subject of death, which is often taboo. I always remember after my uncle passing, and we were off to see my aunt, and we were in the car. And I remember my mother turning round and saying, "Don't mention your uncle." And I remember thinking, why? But looking back on it, I can see it was another part of that little bit of taking that understanding of death away. Again, it was a little bit of a taboo subject. So, of course, before we know it, we're conditioned to that big outside world. And yet the animal kingdom largely stays as it is and always has been. I often think as well that if we were allowed to nurture that psychic ability, we could be able to deal with many of the world's harsher events. And I read one story, and it's a true story, and it was from Mum who said, "My 2.5-year-old came into the room on Tuesday night and said, 'Where is Grandpa going? he said goodbye. Mum told her, Grandpa's at home and in his room. She thought it was odd because her father-in-law never said goodbye, but always said, see you later. They found out the next morning that he'd passed away. Now, to me, that's quite a heartwarming story that he came to say goodbye. Others might be a little bit scared. Others might have said to the child, you're still imagining it. So what I found, if a child has a psychic faculty, very often, in many ways, it is taken away. Not always, but often. There was another story that I read, and this was a lady called Dana, and she said, my daughter Jaylin is 13. She's talked about spirits since she was a toddler. When she hit 10, it got really extreme. She's currently seeing a therapist and a psychiatrist and is now on some heavy meds to help with what they call hallucinations. Tends to work for a while, but then the hearing and the seeing things returns. She said, I'm at a total loss. She can clearly hear and she can see spirits, and it terrifies her. Now, she said, I've done a lot of research on mental illness, and some of the symptoms fit, but others do not. She said, she knows the difference between fantasy and reality. She said, which makes me think it's not a mental illness that she's got. She said, I don't know what to think or how to help my child. And she went on to ask for advice on how she could help. So again, I'm thinking, if a child has that psychic faculty, and then it's considered as a mental illness, what do we do about it? We're trying to treat something rather than nurture something. Now, with the psychic ability, I look back on my own life, and now starting to approach 50, I look back on early life and teenage years. And before first doing this talk, I asked a few folk, rightly or wrongly, what they kind of thought about me in childhood. Now, one person said, well, you were a bit different. Asked them to explain more. One person said, you were a bit strange. So I started regretting asking these questions by then. One person, though, said a little bit nice. They said, you know, you were a bit quiet, more sensitive, and definitely not fitting into the normal teenage boy. And one said it was something you could not quite put your finger on, but they said there was just something a little bit different. Now, I do know I used to be quite sensitive. What sometimes happened was that I could feel quite edgy for a couple of days, and I didn't know why. And in one instance, 2 days later, my aunt had a very bad car crash and was injured. And there was different stories like that. There was that slight edginess, and then something would happen. What I can say, though, quite categorically, is that during those years, I did not see dead people. Had that happened, I would have ran. It was just something that never happened. There was these wee moments, these wee edgy times, but that was it. When things really started to change was round about 18, and my father died. Now, he died from breast cancer, and the reason I mention that is there was another spooky little moment. But it was probably his passing and the events afterwards that started taking me down that psychic side. Now, we had moved house a year before my father died, and the house wasn't terribly old. That time it was a 1950s normal stone-built, semi-detached house. I know it was built in old farmland. I do not know if there was old buildings there prior. I have no idea. And I can't really remember anything odd happening straight away. There was just one incident one night when there was a crash. My father came downstairs, being the brave one, went into the kitchen, and I think he found that a hairbrush or something had fallen from the worktop onto the floor. That was it. And that was probably the only kind of spooky moment that we had of how this got from the worktop to the floor. But it was after my father died that things really started to happen. And my mother suddenly took very ill, and she was in hospital, and she was quite seriously ill. I remember going in to visit her, and then I remember coming back home. I remember stepping into the door. We had 2 doors, into the hall, into the lounge. And I remember walking into the lounge, and there was a heaviness, and I've never quite found the words to describe it. It was like walking through a heavy, cold air or water or something like that. But from the moment you went in, I felt this. And I've only ever felt it once again. I remember sitting down, and I remember hearing a thud from upstairs. And at first I thought, it's the cat. I mean, it was footsteps then that happened next. The thud, footsteps from one end of the room to the other. And I still thought, it's the cat. Only to go through to the kitchen 5 minutes later, open the back door, and the cat was wanting in. So I couldn't explain that one. There was no one living next door at the time, so there's no way sound could carry. So I've got to admit, that time, a little bit scared. And there was a few incidences after that as well. And I remember my mother, when she got out of hospital, and it was many weeks later, that one night she said, "Can I ask a question?" And for some reason I knew what was coming. And she said, "Have you ever heard anything funny in this house?" I said, "Well, once or twice." I said, "How?" Well, she said, the other night, she said, I was sitting in the lounge, and I heard the inner door going, not the front door, but the inner door going. She said, I heard someone just climb the stairs, walk over the upstairs room. She said she sat there petrified for 10 minutes before she could even move. A few months later, my brother's girlfriend had kind of moved in on us. Not quite sure how all that came about, but she did. And then one night, when we got back in, she said the question, "Did anyone come back for anything?" We said, "No." She said, "It was really strange." She said, "I was taking a bath." She said, "I suddenly heard the inner door going and someone climbing the steps." She moved out a week later. But why I mention these stories, that I suddenly realized that where I had that experience, my mother had that experience, my brother's girlfriend had a similar experience. We had not spoken about them until really after they happened. And that's when I realized that, there's something else going on here. That then takes us on, and I think it was a number of months. But it was something that happened again that really started me looking at that subject of, are we all psychic? Then came in the mediumship, and then the paranormal. And I believe very much these three go together. But I want to speak about my mother again just briefly. And she was invited along to a spiritualist church by a friend where they were giving readings. I was kind of still Mr. Skeptical at the time. I always looked for a logical explanation. My mother went along. She was quite happy. She came back the odd time and said, "Got a message." That's fine. But one day they were having a fundraising day, and somehow I got dragged along. I can't even remember how. I think I was giving my mother a lift or something like that, and I went in. And they had what they called mini readings. So I thought, I'm going to get one of these mini readings. So there I went, it was my time. And I have to say, I sat down, I just went like that, with that look of prove it. And I have to say, she started to. Now, the first thing that she said, I've got a man here, and his name is John. I thought, yep, that's my father's name, but common name. Then she went up and said, he's pointing here to his heart, but it's not his heart. Remember what I said, my father had breast cancer. Now, she described him, pretty much accurate. But then she started to mention other things, such as names, occurrences, memories. And she did mention a few things that I had to say no to. And one of them, she said, your mum had a miscarriage late on in pregnancy. And I said, no, I would have known if that had happened. When I came out of the reading and later asked my mother, she said, actually, it's true. She said it was just something I've never ever mentioned. There were other things she mentioned as well. She mentioned my father's side of the family. She mentioned there was a grandmother who used to read flames in the fire for people. I never even knew this could be done, but apparently there is a name for it. And I'm not even going to try and pronounce it because I always fail each time I try. But again, I said no. Turns out it was true. She also told me of an aunt on my mum's side of the family who would have called herself, she said, a witch. And I thought, oh, that's good, okay. And seemingly it was to do with tea leaves and everything. And it wasn't until a few years later when we were clearing out the house after man had died, and hidden was the book of fortune telling and the cup and everything, which I've still got to this day. And it's something like the 1934 book of fortune telling. Why I'm mentioning this is that I realized that this could not be mind reading at play. Because how could she tell me things I did not know until I asked? Certainly, the thing about the miscarriage that my mother never ever told me about, and it was quite late on in pregnancy. She never mentioned it, and I'm thinking, what's going on here? It was the next thing that she said that really kind of took me by surprise. And she said, in a few years, she said, you'll be doing this as well. And I remember thinking, that's it, I've had enough. I'm out of here. Somehow, and I'm not going to go through all the details, but somehow I managed to go along to one of the workshops and things and really took it from there. And I really looked into that psychic ability. And that's where I found it fascinating. And the best way of describing that psychic ability, and I'm sure many, many people will understand some of these occurrences, but the best one that I can find is, for instance, when we go to see a house, to buy it or to rent it, whatever, we go through that front door. We're just through that front door. We've not even gone into any of the rooms yet. We're in the hall. But somehow that house feels right or it feels wrong. Does that make sense? It does. We've not seen any of the rooms, but we just know. And I very much think that is a psychic, but what are we picking up on? And could it be memories within the walls? Could it be that there was something there before the house was built? Could it be that there was unhappy things that took place? Equally, there are the times we think, do you know what? This house just feels right. It feels home. It feels perfect. Again, is that psychic at play? Since then, and developing the psychic and into the mediumship, into the paranormal, I've suddenly realized how much we can use that psychic. And again, I'm hoping a lot of people will understand. I have a friend who can go into an old location, and for some reason he can touch the wall, and suddenly he can draw a picture, describe how that room used to look. And he could draw it, and each time it actually tallies up with how that room did look, if they still got all the old pictures or the old drawings. Now, of course, many folks say that the walls in some way are a bit of a memory tape, and they pick up on many things that have happened, and often the emotionally charged ones. And therefore, when we look into the paranormal aspect, and even the psychic aspect, it's not actually a haunting, but a replay of an event. There's one classic case, and I'm sure a lot of people again will have heard of this, and it's the classic case of the Roman soldiers who are frequently seen to march through a cellar. And the cellar actually lies on the site of an old Roman road. Now, it's actually worth looking at the story. And the reason being is because of the proof that came later for this person. And this is how the story was detailed in the news. The Roman soldiers were seen in February 1953 by an apprentice plumber called Harry Martingale as he worked in the cellars of the Treasurer's House in York. A procession of Roman soldiers walked through the cellar. Now, Harry's account was as follows. He said, "I was standing on a ladder when he heard what he described as a tinny trumpet call. At first he thought that the sound must be coming from the road above him. However, he heard the sound several times, and each time it appeared to get closer and closer." It's what came next, I think, that frightened him. He says, "Suddenly a smallish Roman soldier carrying a sort of trumpet and wearing a kilt appeared through the wall. A rider on a large horse then followed. He said they walked across the room and disappeared through the wall on the opposite side of the room. Now, not surprisingly, he did fall from his ladder and ran and crouched in terror. Now, even then after that, as if he was not terrified enough, he said next followed about 20 more Roman soldiers. He said all had dark complexions and seemed very dirty, dishevelled, despondent, and looked at the ground as they marched. He said they were dressed in green tunics with plumed helmets, and they carried short swords and spears. There was nothing ghostly about them," he said. "They just appeared quite solid. But the oddest thing," he said, "was that the Roman ghosts appeared to be marching on their knees. It was only when they got to the part of the floor that had been dug away that he realized that they were actually walking on the original Roman road that was well beneath the cellar floor." Now, eventually, he said, they disappeared, and he picked up his tools and he ran and never went back. Now, the reason I mention that story is that his account of what happened was first dismissed. And that was due to various particulars of his description that did not fit with accepted history. For instance, he said that soldiers carried round shields rather than the more traditional square Roman shields, and that they had laced their sandals up to their knees and not their ankles. However, it's only been recently discovered from excavations at Hadrian's Wall that in the 4th century, auxiliary troops carried round shields, and they did lace their sandals just as he described. And at the time of his encounter, it was not even known that auxiliary Roman soldiers had even been stationed in York. So again, why do I give this example? And it's an example of someone seeing an event from the past, whether it's just a recording or whether it is a haunting. But what he sees at first, as I said, does not tie in with the known history at the time until it is proven later on. So whilst many may say it was just imagination, or some may even say it was a made-up story, the descriptions again were verified at a later date. So I guess what was going on? Was it a haunting, the paranormal, the psychic at play? And we have many examples of spirits, ghosts, hauntings, etc., that seem to be a permanent fixture of a place. Often unexplained footsteps, cold spots, apparitions, the feeling of being watched. Again, this leads into the question of using the psychic. And I remember a study on TV, and it was a very, very interesting study. And there was a number of people sat behind a one-way glass window looking out. So, of course, they could see out, no one could see in. And it was set up in a way that the people looking out were looking at a queue of people in another room queuing up for tickets. So what those that were behind the glass window would do, they would look up for 20 seconds, then look down for 20 seconds. What they found was very, very interesting. When they spent the 20 seconds looking out the one-way glass window, those queuing on the side would start to look at the window as if they were being watched. Again, when they put their heads down for 20 seconds, it didn't happen. Folk just kept queuing and getting their tickets as normal. So you can see, even by that study, that you can have that feeling of being watched. Again, is it that psychic at play? Now, this is quite a fantastic place, quite an eerie place. And it's a place called Goblin Haw. And it's in Gifford, which is East Lothian, and probably about 20 miles outside Edinburgh. The reason I bring that in here is if there's one place you want that feeling of being watched, I recommend this place. I've been to it a few times. The odd time I've sworn I'll never go back, and then I usually do. But it's got quite an unsettling history as well. And each time I've gone, and we've usually gone in groups, it's amazing to see how many people come away and say they had that feeling of being watched. Now, it's mixed up with stories of sorcery, medieval magic, and everything like that. And although it's supposed to be haunted and apparitions have seen, that's not why I give this example. It's just, again, that feeling of being watched when you're there. An example of that happening. But equally, that feeling of being watched at times, and probably many times have experienced this as well. But then looking at the psychic again, and looking at what we've covered, going into that house for the first time, feels right, it feels wrong. That feeling of being watched. But also as well, how many times has someone thought the phone was going to ring and it does? Or you think of someone you've never seen in ages or years, and suddenly you run into them, or you hear about them, or you hear from them. There's also another aspect. And remember what I spoke about was that way of feeling edgy when I was growing up and something would happen. Many folk have commented on that feeling of impending doom at times. And seemingly that is something that is very common in heart attack patients when they say they have had that feeling of impending doom days or even sometimes weeks before the heart attack itself. And when I looked into this, I found a very interesting story. And it's where similar scenarios happened centuries ago. Now, of course, Europe had quite a lot of problems during the late Middle Ages, and wars, religious revolutions, and of course, the plague. Now, one disease known as the sweating sickness would take people from being perfectly healthy, basically to dead, over the course of one day. It actually struck Anne Boleyn during the height of her courtship with Henry VIII. And if she hadn't survived it, of course, what would have happened with history? But what happened about this disease in most cases was that the first symptom of it was most people had this feeling of impending doom. And these cases are recorded. And very interesting when you look back on a similar scenario from centuries ago. But then, of course, we look at the psychic premonitions that go back many, many years again. And I came across an excellent story which basically dates back to the war and shows how the psychic may have been used for impending danger. Now, during the war, like many mothers who feared for their family's safety during World War II, one was Mona Miller. And she was evacuated from London to the peaceful seaside town of Babbacombe in Devon. Now, it seemed to her like a wise precaution, but shortly after that, and she arrived there with her young children, she became increasingly uneasy. She said, I had a feeling that I must leave Devon and return home. At first, I dismissed the idea. Why leave when I was so happy and contented despite the war going on around me? But the feeling increased and increased. And she actually said the walls of the room seemed to speak to me. She said they seemed to say, go home to London, time and time again. She'd resisted this for a number of months. And then she said one day she knew she had to leave. She just had to leave. So on a Saturday in late 1942, they travelled back to London, and a few days later, she received a letter from a friend in Devon, and it said, thank God you took the children on Saturday, she wrote. Early Sunday morning, Jerry dropped 3 bombs and one fell in the house where you were living, demolishing it and killing all the neighbours on either side. So, again, that sense of impending doom, and again, was it the psychic at play? But she was not the first person and will not be the last to experience such feelings. And there have been many cases reported, famous figures, US President Abraham Lincoln, Mark Twain, Winston Churchill, who all experienced even dream premonitions or intuitive hunches, as they called them, which led them to obtain information on events to come. And in all these cases, they usually did. In the weeks before his death, Lincoln was extremely melancholy. he had seen kind of images of his own death, and he had been dreaming of it himself. On one occasion, he said, he looked in the mirror and saw a double reflection, one image much paler and blurrier than the other. He told his wife that he thought it meant that he had survived his first term, but wouldn't survive his second of presidency. Now, the week prior to his death, Lincoln had a dream of hearing crying in a distant room of the White House. He went to this room in the dream, and he found a coffin in it. He asked the weeping person who had died, and the person responded that it was the president. In his dream, Lincoln looked into the coffin and saw himself, a premonition of what was about to be. So again, as my talk started off, like the animal kingdom, is there a psychic in all of us that in many ways can be used to protect us, to warn us of danger, keep us safe? Have we throughout the history in many ways lost this? Or as many people say, are we evolving to a more spiritual way now, where we will regain the faculty, the sixth sense, the psychic, perhaps a new way of life? I'm now used to many spooky occurrences and things that happen and coincidences. And there was one that happened 2 days ago. And I have to say, it made me a wee bit fearful of driving down, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm writing a book at the moment, and I was up in the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre in Edinburgh, where I've been doing the writing. And part of the book is around a local folklore story. And it's about a young girl who used to bring the milk down to the village. Her parents die when she's young, but she still keeps on delivering the milk. She's referred to as being very odd, very strange, and because it was the time of people being accused as witches, it wasn't long before she was accused of being one. And that comes about because as she delivers the milk, 4 of the deaths in the village occur the night after the milk is curdled. Now, assuming it's a local folklore story, in each case, the milk is curdled. Now, I was sitting at the desk, and I was writing about this. And I still remember the time, it was 3:30. As I'm writing this, there's a guy came down from upstairs who was taking a couple of groups. He comes down the stairs with 2 bottles of milk, and he said, "The milk's off, the milk's curdled." Now, my first thought was, so this happens 4 occasions before the person dies the next day. Do I really want to drive down the next day? But thankfully, everything was okay. But I just sat there and thought, I had no explanation. It was just such a spooky coincidence. And many others have happened as well. But again, many people will have these similar stories as well. There's 2 quotes I love, and one is Isaac Watts, who said, "Do not expect to arrive at certainty in every subject which you pursue. There are 100 things wherein we mortals must be content with probability, where our best light and reason will reach no further." There's another quote I love, and it's much more up to date. But maybe some folk have read, it's a very good book, Kieran O'Keefe's book, The Great Paranormal Clash. And I think it sums up a lot of what we do. And he says that, we'll have the scientists, we'll have the skeptics on one side, we'll have the believers on another. But if we can kick some ideas about in no man's land, perhaps we will gain a better understanding and more answers to something that has fascinated the human race from its earliest of times. And I have to say, from my own point of view, it's a journey that very often there is no answers for, but it's a journey worth taking. And as I said, nothing really surprises me anymore. So thank you, and I think there's some time for questions.
Probably just a couple of questions.
That's fine. If anyone has any.
Oh, can't see. Anyone with a question? Ooh. Oh, well, we do have one here.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
I just wonder if you've looked at how numbers come into people's lives and what relevance there is to certain numbers that keep reoccurring.
Such as things come in threes.
Yeah.
Very often does.
In my own case, I see my birth date time and time again on clocks, on DVD counters. I just wonder if you had any experience of
I've heard of
why
that as well.
numbers come
One number comes in and keeps coming in, keeps coming in. I have had that happen. Do you know what I do with it? Add it to my lottery numbers, but it's still not doing me any good. But yes, joking aside, I know a lot of people that, as such as the phrase, things come in threes. And I know one person that always believes that. And actually they said the other week, I think they had 3 people that passed in their life of the last year, and she said, that's number 3, we'll be fine from there. But equally, seeing numbers and constantly seeing them, whether it's a 3, a 7, a 17, and I don't know why. Do you know for yourself why that comes out?
No, I just see my own birth date all the time. It might be because I'm looking for it, but it always seems to leap out at me. And people say the same thing about 1111 and 911 seem to always crop up.
Yep. It's also amazing as well, even taking out the numbers when you're suddenly discussing something or look at something, and then for days that follow, you're reading about the same thing in the paper or somebody mentions it, things like that. And just another quick story here. I mentioned my mother. My mother passed away in October last year with dementia. But what I found was that, and it must have been 2 or 3 occasions over the months, I could be in the car, I switched on the radio, and it was playing that lovely song, You'll Never Walk Alone, which we played at my mother's passing. 3 times that happened. Immediately when I put the radio. Of course, I'm driving and in tears, but equally I'm thinking, is it a sign? Is it coincidence? I don't know.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Oh, we do. Who?
I just wonder if you'd got any experience of psychometry. I did a course recently and you're holding things that belong to somebody else and you can see where they came from.
Psychometry is really, really interesting, and I have used it. Where I sometimes think it has a little bit of difficulty is if you're trying to read something for someone. For instance, if you had a wedding ring, but that had been passed down, very often I believe you got the energy of those who had that ring prior to as well. So you might be getting a further history. So if someone was to buy something from a second-hand shop, the chances are you're going to get a little bit of their history as well, which you wouldn't know. But equally, I have been involved with a couple of kind of investigations up north, which was psychometry, and to really look at what was going on. It's something that can be very, very interesting.
Brilliant. Thank you. We have one more question. This will be the last one.
I wonder if you've got any view on orbs that appear in photographs and have been doing so for the last...
Oh, the orbs question.
Yeah.
If I'm being honest, okay, dare I say, 95% dust. It's that little odd bit. And I always remember we set up an experiment, and it was in Edinburgh College of Parapsychology, and we left video cameras running one night. And we timed it, because the college was very much in its heyday during the war years and everything. We really brought in some vibrant war music, but we never played this at first. We had, and there was no one in the building when we were recording, but we had the videos on. And for the first, say, hour recording without music, and there was nothing. There was nothing, orbs or dust, maybe the odd wee fleck, but that was it. Then the music was timed to come on, and I think it was about half an hour or something. And during that time, everything was flying about, absolutely, and we couldn't explain it. Also, one time we were in the vaults under the Royal Mile, and the cameras, there was a camera crew there, and there was like wee snake lights that just went up and down, and they had no explanation for this. They hadn't seen it before. So, yeah, very often I think it is dust, but on the odd occasion, when you really get something, you think, no. And also as well, when people take, say, 3 photographs, all in quick succession, and it's the middle one, you get that orb on. So it's not dust coming in or coming out. I think they've really got to kind of be studied. I'm not an expert in studying photographs, I have to say, far from it. But I have seen a few interesting ones and ones that folk can't explain.
Brilliant, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause
Thank
for
you.
Ewan Irvine.
Thank you. Thank you.